Hello and welcome to State of the State, the monthly roundup of Michigan politics and policy brought to you by the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State University and our good friends here at WKAR Studios. I'm Arnold Weinfeld, Associate Director at the Institute, and I'm joined today by Matt Grossman, Director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research, and Dr. Charlie Ballard, a professor in the Department of Economics and Director of our State of the State survey. We finally have some results from our own State of the State survey, which was out in the field this fall. And so, Charlie, maybe we can talk a bit about the results of that survey, what's on the minds of Michigan citizens. I know, Matt, we've also done some work with our Political Insider survey, and maybe we can talk about how they feel about some of these issues as well. But, Charlie, what did we find out? What's on the minds of Michigan citizens in this round?
Well, this was the first survey in which we asked about approval of Gretchen Whitmer, and she opened at 39% favorable. We don't ask approve or disapprove, so we're different from some surveys. We ask, do you rate her performance excellent, good, fair, or poor? And we combine the excellent and good into the favorable category. She opened at 39%. That compares with about 10 percentage points smaller than that in Governor Rick Snyder's last survey. She's nowhere near as high as Jennifer Granholm was back early in this century when she opened up in the high 50s. So, in a sense, Whitmer is sort of more like Snyder than like Granholm, with a lot of people giving the fair. You know, she doesn't have a whole lot of extremes of excellent or poor, but almost half of the people surveyed about Governor Whitmer said she's doing fair.
And I think it's probably important to point out that we did this work a good 6 to 8 months after she had taken office and clearly failed on her campaign promise to deliver more funding to fix the damn road. So
right.
And that matches our results from the insiders as well. We asked the same question of people who work in and around Michigan politics, and it was a total of 40% favorable, so almost exactly the same as the public. And similarly, most people either in the good or fair category. Only 4% thought she was doing excellent. So that includes some people in the administration. So
yeah, Matt, why don't you take a moment to talk about who the population is that we're surveying in that insiders panel?
It includes legislators, legislative staff, administrative officials in policymaking roles, and people in the lobbying and state media community. Okay. But it trends a little bit slightly Democratic, but about as much as the state public. So it's
truly an inside the Beltway look and feel for what's taking place.
Yeah, and usually there's more of a dissonance between what the insiders think and what the public thinks. But here I think they're aligned.
Yeah. And so what about the top issues that are on the minds of those we surveyed?
Well, it's been interesting in the quarter of a century that we've done this survey to see the evolution of that. Back in the 90s, education was number one issue. That was the top on the minds. The economy was going well. Then when the economy slipped badly in the first decade of this century, it was all about jobs in the economy, and education slipped. But in the last few years, it's been about fix the damn roads. Transportation infrastructure is the most frequently cited thing that people think is important for the governor and the legislature. And number two is a more general statement about infrastructure, which might include water and sewer and other infrastructure. So if you put those together, they really are by far the most prominent things in the minds of Michigan residents right now. That's what they want, their infrastructure fixed.
And our insiders are not optimistic. We asked them whether a permanent or a more long-term road funding package would be approved before the 2020 election, and only 4% thought it was likely and 23% somewhat likely. So people are pretty pessimistic over at the Capitol.
And, you know, the longer it goes that we have a stalemate where it's just not possible to get through the legislature funding to fix the roads, people turn to other possible solutions. You may have seen the article in Crane's Detroit Business by Chad Livengood saying, is it time for tolls? If we can't raise taxes, maybe we need to raise revenues in other ways. I sort of think I'd like to personally not rely too heavily on tolls, but if you can't do it one way, you start to think, what can we do?
Bonding has also been mentioned. That was used by Governor Engler many years ago. Doesn't need a vote of the legislature or the people. And, of course, conservative economists have panned that as saying, you're paying now for what you're trying to accomplish into the future, and we'll be paying for that over the course of our children's lives, as they like to say.
Our children's lives.
Yes.
Well, it's one of these cases where the economists and the evidence are generally think, hey, a gas tax is a pretty efficient way. Mm-hmm. It targets the users. It doesn't require putting up a whole bunch of tolling infrastructure. And by the way, our vehicle mileage is improving, and so we're just raising less from the gas tax from the same miles traveled. But try to explain that to the public, and it almost never works. Even among my students, I regularly ask them to just say, how many people want the roads fixed? How many people want the gas tax raised? And you get everybody saying A and nobody saying B. So it is a pretty classic instance of people wanting something for nothing.
Well, I have this Chevy Malibu that I've been driving for years, and it burns gasoline. But I do think a very good chance that my next car will be an electric. And if it's an electric, I'm probably not going to be paying a lot of gasoline taxes.
So, Matt, I'd like to get into this point a little bit, because you've done some work on this about the nationalization of various issues. I've been around. I guess I can say this now. I've been around quite a while around the state politics and state capital issues, and it used to be that infrastructure, although it was a hard issue, especially the roads, because generally speaking, you're correct. You're going to raise the gas tax, which is a natural user fee. But you'd get it done. At the end of the day, it would get done. And now Michigan and other states have struggled to move forward on this. Other states, including some of our surrounding neighboring states, did move through some gas tax increases and funding for roads this year. But is this one of those issues in terms of road funding and infrastructure that we can talk about as being nationalized in the national political arena?
Well, at the national and state level, it's an issue where the parties claim to be in an agreement that we need more infrastructure funding. Both Trump and Clinton ran ads about how they were in favor of large infrastructure packages. But, of course, the other side of that coin is taxes, and taxes are a long-running nationalized issue, and one that continues to nationalize further and that continues to get more polarized. And it has been an issue where Republicans are able to coalesce behind saying no, both at the state and national level. That doesn't mean I would sort of give up on it. As you say, other Republican states have raised the gas tax. Snyder raised the gas tax in a kind of a hidden way on producers. I don't think it was inevitable that they would reach no agreement. I think both the insiders and the public may be placing some of the blame on Whitmer as well and how she pursued it. So I don't know that it was destined to not find any support on the Republican side, but it certainly is an issue that divides the parties.
So, and you mentioned in informally polling students on the issue, they want better roads, but they too don't seem to be willing to raise taxes. Does that become a teachable moment on how we get things done, or how to point them in a particular direction in terms of how to provide public services, and in terms of the funding?
I don't know that
there are lots of teachable moments.
I don't know that it changes opinions, but they do recognize that it's an inconsistency in their view that they want something funded but don't want to pay for it. But the gas tax is just a very visible tax that people see the price everywhere, and it's always been more controversial for that reason. So, they say the same things. They say, oh, well, why not toll roads? And so if that is the only way, then maybe that's the way that you get people to pay for something in a pretty equally visible way, but at least a way that connects the driving to the payment.
When I teach courses about economics of taxation, and I think that there are two things. One is kind of a general dislike of taxes, but the other is, we should raise taxes. Tax that other guy. Just don't tax me. And you see that a lot. We've had these discussions about a sales tax on services. I remember a conversation with a local lobbyist who represents the Bar Association, and I was advocating for extending the sales tax to services and entertainments. This person said, "Oh, you're absolutely right. Yes, we should do it on all of these services, just not on the attorneys." So,
Charlie, you noted that in prior years, jobs, the economy, education had been some of the top issues on the minds of those we survey. Where did that fall this time around with roads?
That was in the next tier.
It was.
It's much more diffuse now than it was back in the 90s. Education would be the top thing for 40% of our respondents. And then a decade ago, jobs in the economy would be the top issue for almost everybody. Now we had 17% on roads, 11% on other infrastructure, 10% on jobs in the economy, and then just a whole bunch of things where 3% or 5% of people say it's most important, whether it's the environment or so some people refer to abortion and other issues like that. It's just a very wide range of things that are on people's minds.
And that matches the national trends in the Gallup Most Important Problems series, that there's been a diversification over time in what people say, and there's less of an overtime association. In other words, it used to be that with an economic cycle, everybody would either move to mentioning the economy or move away from it based on events, and that isn't happening anymore.
Of course, we've had now 10 and a half years of slow but more or less steady economic growth, and so it's not surprising that the economy is not on people's minds, although I'll take this pulpit to say what I say is whenever I get the chance. This last year has been slow in the Michigan economy, and not just slow here, but slow throughout the upper Midwest. From January to November, we don't have the December numbers yet for the states, while the U.S. economy was growing at a couple 100,000 jobs a month. Michigan barely grew, just a couple of thousand. And if you take Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Wisconsin all together, net job losses in that region. So there is something of a disconnect. I think it may have to do with the further slowdown in manufacturing. But if that trend were to continue for long enough, I think people would notice, and you would start to get more concern about jobs in the economy.
But right now, I think we also saw in this round, people are feeling pretty good about their economic situation.
They are, because the economy may be kind of flat, but it's flat at a pretty good place. And so we ask people about their current finances, and 62% say excellent or good. That's not the highest. The highest ratings we ever had for almost all of these economic indicators were back in the late 90s when the economy was indeed booming. But far better than what we had in really the whole stretch from 2006 to 2011 or so. Mm-hmm. So people are feeling generally pretty good and pretty upbeat about the future. A strong majority think that they're going to be better off a year from now than they are now. So, it's people remain fairly optimistic. And as long as the economy, I think if it continues kind of flat, that probably won't put much of a dent in it, but it might. If we ever get into a recession, which we probably will someday, that's going to have an effect on those numbers.
And that usually bodes well for the incumbent president, doesn't it?
It does. And yet, Donald Trump's numbers are not that great. His favorable, excellent, or good ticked down a little bit to about 31%. He's been in the high 20s, low 30s by the way that we do this, that either the excellent or good during his entire time. And in this survey, almost exactly half gave him a rating of poor. His ratings are much more polarized than those of either Gretchen Whitmer or Rick Snyder before her. He gets way more excellence, but way more poors, whereas Whitmer and Snyder tend to get a lot of fair.
Mm-hmm. And as you might expect, the political insiders are just negative on Trump overall. It's not so much polarized as negative. There's only 19% total with a favorable opinion, including only 4% excellent. So that's the same as Whitmer, so they might be hard graders. But it's actually 64% that give him a poor rating in our elite sample. And even among Republican elites, he does not have good ratings among Michigan insiders. That is leading them to expect Democratic victory. 75% of our insider panel says that the Democrats are likely to win Michigan in the 2020 election. So before the Democrats get too excited, I'll point out that this same clairvoyant group of insiders predicted a Clinton victory at 90%.
I do predict one thing will be different for the Democrats. I think they will actually have a campaign in Michigan for the 2020 presidential election.
Before the last couple weeks.
Yeah, we'll see a Democratic presidential candidate and or vice president campaigning in the state numerous times.
I expect we'll see that. We did not see that in 2016, and we believe that had an effect.
Yeah, indeed, and I'm sure the president and vice president will be here as well.
President Trump's ratings, as you might expect, there are big divides by race, by gender, by political party. Women, for instance, are twice as likely to give a favorable rating to Gretchen Whitmer as they are to give a favorable rating to Donald Trump. Only 3% of African Americans gave high marks to President Trump. So big divides that we've seen going on for a long time in American politics, and of course a big partisan divide as well.
Well, I'm sure African Americans will be reminded of candidate Trump's famous quote about what do you have to lose over the course of the next year or so. So it'll be very interesting to see how that works out with an economy that is doing okay, as you said, not as strong,
not gangbusters,
but doing okay. People feel pretty good about their financial situation and where they might be in the next year, and that usually bodes well for the incumbents. Now, along with the numbers on President Trump and Governor Whitmer, we again surveyed people on how they feel about government generally.
Yeah, we've been asking throughout the entire time of our survey, asking about trust in government. And we ask about different levels, local, state, and federal. About nearly all or most of the time, can you trust them? Some of the time, seldom, or almost never. And it's been true throughout the survey that the one that gets the highest rating is the most favorable is the local government. And I think that makes sense. The local government, hey, that's the city council, that's the school board, that's my next door neighbor, I know these people. The state government is in faraway Lansing, and then the federal government is in even more faraway Washington, D.C., and that's usually the ranking, local first, then state, then federal, and that's what held this time. More than 40% say they can trust the local government most of the time. Only 14% for the federal government, and a little bit more than that for state. Most of these trends fairly constant, with local number one, state number two, federal number three. Two other things in the history of the survey that are interesting. One is, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, all levels of government, including federal, had a big spike. People thought, hey, President Bush has responded strongly to this national tragedy. Then they separated again. But a big trend is, it used to be that when asked about state government, people said they were more likely to say that they could trust it than usually wouldn't trust it. That's flipped. Now a lot more people say seldom or almost never could they trust state government. That flip happened about 12 years ago. Perhaps it was in the aftermath of some of the budget crises and state government shutdowns that we had when Jennifer Granholm was governor and she faced a Republican legislature. It's not a focus group, so we don't have all the reasoning that people go in. But trust in state government is definitely less than it was 15, 20, 25 years ago.
Matt, you noted that our group of political insiders overwhelmingly believe that Democrats will do well here in Michigan in the upcoming election. But at the state level, what are your thoughts about how the Republicans have been able either to maintain their own agenda here in the state legislature? You know, this past year we had insurance reform that many would argue was more Republican policy than anything else. They've been able to forestall any kind of tax increases, especially on the gas tax. Do you think that they'll be able to go home in a term-limited era where we have, I think, about 20 or 22 term-limited House members and be able to maintain their majority moving forward based on the policy that they've been able to implement or thwart?
Well, we talked about nationalization, and there is research that even in voting for state legislature, it matters more your opinion of the president than anything about what is happening in state government. That doesn't mean you can't be affected if there's a big visible thing like in Wisconsin or Kansas where people sort of get fed up with current policy, but I don't know that we've seen enough happen to produce a backlash of that sort. Our political insiders were also asked to predict how many seats the Republicans would have in the Michigan House, and the average was right at an even split. So they're predicting a pretty close battle for control of the Michigan House this year.
If we were to get an even split, it's not at all clear that would be bad, because back in the early 90s, there was one session where Curtis Hertel, the Democrat, and Paul Hilligans, the governor, not the governor, the Republican, had to share the speaker's job. And I know some of the people who were there at the time, and to a person, they say that because they had a 55-55 tie, they had to talk to each other, and they treated each other pretty well and got some things done.
Well, so we would get a test of whether that was an institutional matter or if culture has changed.
Yeah, as one of those who was there at the time as a staff member, I can tell you that a lot of that success was based on those two gentlemen's personalities.
And it wasn't necessarily institutionalized.
No, there were, people. It's always interesting how we always look back, and many of us look back at that fondly, right? I mean, it's an era of some cooperation for sure, where Democrats and Republicans shared the chair on a month-to-month basis. We did get some things done, you could say, but it was based largely on those two personalities of Curtis Hertel and Paul Hilligans, and their ability to realize the moment in front of them and understand the importance of that moment and being able to move ahead
and rise above petty partisanship.
Well, and that was an era pre-term limits when legislators had really come from the bottom up and had been around a while to forge relationships and understand each other a bit better than probably today under term limits. So if that happens, we'll have two new leaders, right? Because both Democratic leader Gregg and the Speaker Chatfield are term limited.
Yes.
So Curtis and Paul, they
knew
were already
each other.
there. They were already there. They knew each other. They knew they were going to be leaders of their caucus. And those discussions, I'm sure, are going on right now, and some insiders would tell you it's pretty clear who's going to be the next Democratic leader, who's going to be the next speaker, but they haven't held those powerful positions yet.
Right.
And when the parties do come together, they do have the ability to sell their solution. The auto insurance reform, which was controversial at the time and still is among some people, it actually had fairly broad approval in our insider survey and has also generated some public approval in other surveys. So when the parties get behind something and pass it, if they did make a deal on roads, for example, there's reason to believe that they could sell it to the public together.
Now, Matt, we just had a forum on the redistricting proposal and how it's moving ahead. And one of our own at MSU put forth the notion that if indeed a fair map is drawn, it would still probably lean Republican. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Right. John Aguia in Charlie's department has been doing some work on redistricting and trying to take into consideration the fact that the map drawers will have to take local boundaries into consideration, and that Democrats are largely and increasingly concentrated in urban areas in Michigan. And so what that means is that it's just much harder to draw a pro-Democratic gerrymander than it is to draw a pro-Republican gerrymander. Now, he pointed out that the current maps are still gerrymandered. That is, they provide more Republican advantage than you would just by drawing relatively straight lines. But that the commission, we should expect to still draw a map that slightly favors Republicans. He also said that the congressional districts are more unnaturally gerrymandered than are the legislative districts. So the idea that this commission is going to make it possible for Democrats to win control of the legislature when they win more than half of the votes statewide, I think he rightly showed is unlikely. That because of the geographic placement of people, the Democrats are not going to have to win the state by 8 points, but they're still going to have to win more than 50%, yes, in order to control the legislature.
The system that we have in the U.S., where we have geographical districts and it's first past the post, the person with the most votes wins, that is a system that favors any party whose people are geographically dispersed. And in our country, that's the Republicans. In many of the countries in Europe, their parliaments are on a proportional basis. So, if your party gets 53% of the seats, of the votes, you get 53% of the seats. So that would be a different. That's a very different outcome. We have had many times here in Michigan, Democrats get most of the votes, but Republicans maintain control of the chamber. That couldn't happen under a proportional voting scheme. But I don't hear a whole lot of groundswell of pushing for proportional voting here in Michigan.
And there is a almost near global pattern of urban-rural increasing division with the more conservative parties taking the rural areas. And even if you just ignore the U.S.-Canada boundary and look across to Ontario, you see the very same map of liberal and conservative voting. So these are part of a transition to more social and cultural issues coming to the fore in politics, and I don't think it's something we should expect to change anytime soon.
Thank you, and thank you both for being here. In February, we will have had the State of the State speech and the budget release. I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about then as well. Thank you again. Thank you for joining us here on this edition of the State of the State, and thank you again to our friends here at WKAR. This is Arnold Weinfeld.